Good afternoon, students. Today is Friday, 26 February 2021. This is the second video for this week. Both of them will be covered on the second exam, which is several weeks from now. Yesterday, you took your first exam. I have printed out all of the scores. This weekend, I will compile some statistics for you and post them on Canvas so you can have an idea of how you did relative to other students who took the exam. Remember, your score and ultimately your grade in the course does not depend on how other students do. So the only reason I'm posting the statistics is in case you're interested in how you did compared to other students who took the exam. So that'll be this weekend. Now, a couple of days ago, I posted a video on what's called supererogation. And today we're going to move on to another section called promises. Promising, believe it or not, poses a problem for ACT utilitarianism. Let me explain why by quoting from Feldman on page 52. He says there, "It is widely agreed that the practice of making and keeping promises provides a number of serious problems for ACT utilitarianism," unquote. So my goal today is to help you see what the problem is and how a utilitarian might go about solving that problem or avoiding the criticism. So let's begin with some general things. Feldman doesn't go into these, but I think it's important background information. What is a promise anyway, and what does it mean to break a promise? Well, think of a promise as a form of commitment. When you make a commitment, you are undertaking an obligation. You are binding yourself. And a promise is one type of a commitment. Other commitments are a vow. If you vow to do something, for example, a marital vow. When you get married, you take a vow to do such and such, right? To love your spouse through thick and thin, and so forth. And that's a solemn commitment that people make to one another. Another type of commitment is an oath. If you're ever called to jury duty, you will have to take an oath. If you're called as a witness in a court, you'll take an oath to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. And that, again, is a form of commitment. If you make a pledge, if you pledge some money to a public television or public radio, there will come a time when they will call in your pledge, and you will be expected to pay the amount of money that you pledged. If you make a resolution, a New Year's resolution, for example, you are resolving, perhaps only to yourself, to do or not to do a certain act or line of behavior. Now, maybe your commitment is only to yourself in a case like that, but still it is a commitment. You're trying to bind yourself when you make a resolution. So think of a promise as one of many different types of commitment. Now, what does it mean to break a promise? Typically, when you make a promise, it calls for you to do or refrain from doing something in the future. So I may promise to give you a sum of money 1 week from today, perhaps in return for something you gave to me. Suppose you give me something that I want and I don't have enough money right now to pay you. I may instead promise to pay you 1 week from now when I get my paycheck. Okay, so sometimes people promise reciprocally. You promise something to me and I promise something to you. On other occasions, somebody does something for someone else and the second person promises to reciprocate in the future. So let's think of a promise as a commitment to do or refrain from doing something in the future. If the time comes for you to perform your promise and you do not do so, you are said to have broken a promise. Now, there may or may not be a good excuse or justification for breaking your promise. Sometimes we break promises even when we have no good reason to do so. Sometimes we break promises when we do have a good reason. Suppose I promise to meet a friend for lunch. Just as I'm leaving to meet the friend, some accident occurs and someone's endangered. I think no one would blame me if I stopped and attended to the accident victim, even though it meant breaking the promise to my friend. After all, I can make up a broken promise to my friend later or in some other way. Maybe as soon as I'm able, I'll call my friend uh, who's waiting for me at the restaurant, and I'll say, look, something came up. I decided it was best for me to save someone involved in an accident rather than show up and have lunch with you. I'm sorry that you were left wondering where I was and that I wasted your time. But I'll tell you what, we'll meet again soon. And when we do, I'll pay for the lunch to make up for the inconvenience I caused. So even though I have a perfectly good justification for breaking the promise, still something important was sacrificed, your friend's time. And you can do something to make up for that. So you're perfectly justified in breaking the promise, but still you should do something to repair the inconvenience or to make up for the inconvenience. Now, let's start thinking about utilitarianism. By now, you know that to the act utilitarian, each act is evaluated on its own merits. So a particular broken promise could turn out to be the right thing to do according to act utilitarianism. And what would make it the right thing to do? The fact that the fact that breaking the promise would produce the best overall consequences. Breaking the promise might maximize net happiness. And if it did, then according to U sub 7, it would be the right thing to do. Now, sometimes when you make a promise and the time comes to keep it, sometimes keeping the promise will maximize overall happiness. If that is the case, then of course, according to U sub 7, it would be right for you to keep the promise. So to put those two things together, whether it's right or not right to keep a promise depends solely on the consequences of keeping or breaking that promise. That's the view of the act utilitarian. Now, that may not be your view, and it certainly is not the view of everyone. Some people believe that you ought to keep a promise even in those cases where it does not maximize overall happiness. All right? Some people believe that once you've made a promise, you have a strong obligation to keep it, even if it doesn't maximize overall happiness. Okay, so we might say that to a utilitarian, a broken promise could be a useful infidelity. Infidelity means you're not keeping faith. When you break a promise, you're not keeping faith with the person to whom you've made the promise. So let's get into this topic a little bit by discussing a case that Feldman discusses on page 52. We can call it the grandfather case or the grandson case. And here's how it goes. I'm just going to read one paragraph, and then once we read it, we can use it for the rest of our discussion today, right, to illustrate certain points. We'll keep coming back to it. So listen carefully, because almost every fact that Feldman puts into this little story turns out to be relevant. So it's important to keep them all in your head. He says on page 52, suppose a young man has been generously supported throughout his college career by his kindly grandfather. As a graduation present, the grandfather has taken the youth on a round-the-world sailboat trip. The grandson is delighted to go on the trip. Why? Because he loves fishing. However, a storm wrecks their boat, and they're washed ashore on a deserted tropical island. The youth feels fit and healthy, but the ordeal is hard on the grandfather. The old man weakens and at last is on the verge of death. He calls the youth to his side and asks one last favor. Here's what he says: before I die, promise me that once I'm gone, you will bury my body in a suitable grave and say a prayer over it. Now, he's asking the grandson to make a promise. To this point, the grandson has not made the promise. So what happens? According to Feldman, the grandson responds, "Certainly, grandfather. I promise that your remains will be treated with respect." Okay, that's all the grandson said, and then the grandfather dies. So what we have here is a solemn promise made by the grandson. So let's not quibble with that. When I was a kid, we had a little jokey thing we did. We told each other that if you cross your fingers like this and put it behind your back, then when you make a promise, that nullifies the promise. So when you do that, you're not really making a promise. But let's assume that nothing like that occurred in this case. When the grandson said, "Certainly, grandfather," the grandson solemnly promised the grandfather to do what he promised to do. Okay, so let's not quibble with the facts. Let's accept them. Now, Feldman says, what should the grandson do? Suppose the grandson is an act utilitarian. Now, the grandson might not be, we don't know, but just for the sake of discussing this case, suppose the grandson is an act utilitarian, which means a proponent of U sub 7, and the grandson wants to do the right thing. The grandson will engage in a process of reasoning to determine what to do, what the right thing to do is. Think of it as an application of Jeremy Bentham's felicific calculus, where he does all the calculating. Now go back to page 52, and here is what Feldman writes about that case. And eventually we're going to have a ranking of alternative actions. Here we go, next paragraph. The grandson reflects on his alternatives. So for the moment, we're just going to list some of the possible things he could do at that moment. First, he could treat the body as he has promised. This would be somewhat painful since it would require him to dig a grave, carry the grandfather's body to it, and then fill it up again. This would entail a lot of hard work and would produce no pleasure at all for him. For the grandson, being a cold-hearted ingrate, would get no pleasure from seeing the promise kept, and the grandfather, being dead, is in no position to benefit from a proper burial. Since the island is otherwise deserted, no one else would be affected in any way by the grandson's action. Okay, continuing. That's the first alternative. Another alternative would be to cut up the grandfather's body and use it for bait. Now, you may recoil in horror when you read that, but it is a possible action. Keep in mind that the grandson loves fishing, that's why Feldman mentioned that, and would really like to do some surf casting. Of course, he doesn't need to go fishing since the island is well stocked with bananas, pineapples, and mangoes. Nevertheless, he would enjoy using the body for this purpose. Furthermore, he is so callous that he would feel no shame, horror, or disgust at thus misusing the body of his deceased benefactor. And you may remember from the initial paragraph, the grandfather has been very kind to this young man throughout his college career and was taking him on a round-the-world cruise on a ship or on a boat. So the grandfather is the benefactor of the grandson, who is the beneficiary of the grandfather's kindness. Those are the correct terms: benefactor, beneficiary. And according to Feldman, the grandson has other alternative acts as well. He says the grandson really has a very large supply of alternatives. We will consider only the main ones and the utility of each. So here is Feldman doing what Bentham recommends, which is performing a utility calculation. After all, the grandson has plenty of time to do that. So here we go. Feldman is going to list just 4 alternative actions, and he's going to list what seem to be plausible utilities for each of the 4. Action number 1, use the body for bait. Right? That means cutting it up into little pieces and using it as bait for fishing, which would bring the grandson a lot of pleasure. Feldman assigns that act a net positive utility of plus 25, and that's because of the pleasure the grandson will experience. Okay? Second possible act, bury the body according to the promise. In other words, keep the promise. What is the content of his promise? The content was to bury the body. That's what he promised to do. Now, Feldman assigns this minus 10. Why? Because as he explained, it's hot, and in the tropical sun, the grandson will have to work hard to dig the grave, which will take some time. He will then have to drag the grandfather's body to that grave and then cover it all up. So it's a lot of sweat and labor and pain, if you will, dolors. So it's going to come out to a minus 10 if he performs that act. Third possible action, let the body rot where it is. Now that would mean breaking the promise as well. Okay, cutting up the body and using it for bait would be a way of breaking the promise. And letting the body rot where it is would also be a way of breaking the promise or not keeping the promise. Feldman assigns that minus 2, he says, because of the stench, or presumably because of the stench. Right? The body is going to rot eventually, and the grandson is going to be disgusted with the smell, the stench, and it will cause him some grief or offense or disgust. That's minus 2. The fourth possibility is throw the body in the sea. Now that would avoid the problem of stinking or stench, but it would require a little bit of labor to get the body down to the waves where it could then wash out to sea. So that's minus 1. So what's the conclusion? We have to use the word if. We have to say, if these are the only 4 possible actions that are available to the grandson on this occasion, and if the utilities of those 4 acts have been correctly calculated, then the right thing for the grandson to do, and by now you know how that goes, the right thing to do is to perform whichever action is at the top of the ranking. And that, of course, is use the body for bait, which means break the promise. So U sub 7 implies that the grandson ought to break the promise and use the body for bait. Why? Because that action would produce the greatest net balance of happiness or utility. Now, what do you think about that? I suspect many people would be troubled by that. The idea that cutting up his grandfather's body is the right thing to do, morally speaking, it would be very troubling to a lot of people. Maybe even to utilitarians. A utilitarian might say, ooh, that's my theory tells me that it's the right thing to do, but I'm not sure I'm comfortable with that. And in a moment, we'll look at some possible responses that the utilitarian can make to this dilemma, this problem. But let's turn to something else. Well, let me quote Feldman first, and then we'll turn to that something else. On pages 52 and 53, Feldman concludes his discussion by saying, many decent people, maybe not all of them, but many decent people, if confronted with this example, would conclude that the grandson ought to treat the grandfather's body with respect, regardless of the amount of utility that would be produced. In other words, for many decent people, U sub 7 gives the wrong result. And again, in a few minutes, we'll see what the utilitarian might say about that in response to the objection. Now, let me back up for a moment. Let's talk about what an act utilitarian would say in general about promising, because it may surprise you. The utilitarian actually believes that promise keeping is usually the right thing to do, and therefore promise breaking is usually the wrong thing to do. And you'll notice I emphasize the word usually, because The utilitarian would never say always. Okay? The utilitarian doesn't like saying certain types of act are always right or always wrong. The most the utilitarian will want to say is that most acts of a certain sort are right, or most acts of a certain sort are wrong. Why? Because it all depends on whether the particular concrete act maximizes overall happiness. And it may or may not. So the act utilitarian is reluctant to make these categorical claims. Right? That's why they use words like most or many or some rather than all or none. So let me go back to the point I was just making. An act utilitarian, while he or she would never say that all broken promises are wrong, can hold that most of them are wrong. Now, why is that? Well, most broken promises are wrong because broken promises tend to have bad consequences. Let me say that again. Broken promises tend to have bad consequences overall. In fact, if we want to be more precise, we can try to identify which bad consequences broken promises have, typically. And there are 4 categories. Number 1, broken promises tend to have bad effects on the promisee. Now, let's coin a couple of terms. Let's say that the person who makes the promise is the promisor, and the person to whom the promise is made, we will call the promisee. So, promisor, promisee. And I hope you're not confused when I use those terms now. Okay, back to my point. The first bad effect of a broken promise is that it has bad effects on the promisee, the person to whom the promise was made. How do you feel? I'm sure someone who has made a promise to you has broken it. How did you feel? Or if you've never had someone break a promise to you, you can imagine it. How would you feel if that were to happen? I would feel disappointed at a minimum if someone had made a promise to me and then when the time came to keep it, he or she broke it. I would feel disappointment, frustration probably. I would be frustrated because I was expecting some money and it didn't come in, or whatever the promise was. Third, I might be angry. Fourth, which is an uncomfortable emotion, right? We don't like the experience of being angry. Fourth, what if I have relied upon the promise being kept? Some promises are very important. I hope you understand that. What if I am a general contractor? What if I'm a contractor in the housing industry? My job is to see that houses get built properly and on time. I will delegate some of my obligation to what are called subcontractors, a plumber, an electrician, a mason, a cabinet maker, and so on, right? Now, I agree with each of those individuals that I will pay them a sum of money in return for their services. And there's going to be a date, almost certainly. I will say the cabinets must be in by the end of the month. And in order for me to make good on my promise to the homeowner who's expecting to move in at a certain time, I need to make sure that each of my subcontractors gets the work, his or her work done on time and on schedule. If anyone is delayed, it could delay the whole project, and I could end up breaking my promise to the homeowner. Okay, so suppose a particular subcontractor has promised me that the job would be done by the end of the month. If that promise gets broken, I, who have relied upon it being kept, can be out a sum of money. I may have a clause in my contract with the homeowner that says if the house is not ready for move-in by a certain date, I will have to pay a certain sum of money to the homeowner. So that subcontractor, by breaking a promise to me, has cost me money. That's called the reliance interest in the law, right? I have come to rely on this promise to me being kept. And if it's not kept, then I have relied to my detriment. Right? It's detrimental reliance. So I hope you can see that when a promise is broken, it can lead to all kinds of bad results, from disappointment to frustration to anger to even more material things, loss of money, right? Bad consequences in terms of your livelihood. And if you fail to complete your houses on time more than once, you will get a reputation as a home builder for not getting your work done, and people may be reluctant to engage you to have their home built. And that could end up harming your career and your livelihood. So I hope you can see that broken promises can have bad effects on the promisee. Okay, the second of four ways that a broken promise tends to have bad effects is that it has bad effects on observers, or what we might call third parties. If other people notice that the promise was broken, they might, for all we know, get the idea that it's okay to break promises. And that may incline them to be more likely to break their own promises. And that would be a bad thing, right? If you are setting a bad example by breaking your promise, other people may break promises as a result, and that will cause even more frustration, disappointment, material anger, material loss, and things like that. So broken promises have bad effects on people who are not even party to the agreement, right? People other than the promisor or the promisee. Third, the promisor typically experiences bad effects from breaking a promise. How might that be? Well, if you were raised to believe that promises ought to be kept, you'll probably feel pangs of conscience if you break a promise. You will feel guilty and remorseful. And those are very uncomfortable emotions that you will have to experience. They constitute dolors. Right? A dolor, remember, is a pain of a certain sort, or a type of pain. And that would include grief and sadness and guilt and remorse and things like that, and a guilty conscience. So even the people who break promises experience bad effects as a result of the broken promise. Fourth, what about the whole institution of promising? Now, an institution is not a person. The promisee is a person, the promisor is a person, and those third parties or bystanders are people. The institution of promising is not itself a person, but can't it be adversely affected by each broken promise? The institution of promising, if you think of it as a structure, an edifice, like a building, each broken promise has the effect of chipping a little piece off the foundation of that building. And if promise breaking became widespread enough, you can imagine that the foundation of the institution of promising crumbles. And if the foundation crumbles, then the whole structure built up on that foundation will fall to the ground. And so if promising as an institution is a good thing, then each broken promise tends to chip away at it. And that means it's a bad thing. And if it happens often enough, the whole institution could come crumbling down or tumbling down, and that would be bad. Which raises a question, why is the institution of promising a good thing? I think even the act utilitarian would say, yes, of course, the institution of promising and keeping promises is a good thing. And I hope you can see why, but I'll explain it in case you don't. The institution of promising allows us to tie down the future to some extent. Now, imagine if I were building a house on my own. It would take a long time. I would have to be able to do plumbing, electrical, masonry, cabinetry, and everything else. Isn't it much more efficient, if nothing else, for me to hire other people to help me and to pay them, people who are expert in electrical work or plumbing and so on. But notice, in order for that to work, we have to rely on each other. We have to make promises to each other, and we rely on those promises being kept. So when I make a promise to somebody and get a promise in return, that helps me tie down my future. I can now expect that in a certain amount of time my house will be built because all these people have made promises to me. Without the institution of promising, it might take much longer, and I may not even have any confidence that I'll manage to get the house built at all, even if I have all the time in the world. So promising is nice, I hope you'll agree, because it helps us tie down the future. It helps us make plans for the future. Right? We're relying on other people to keep their word and do what they say they're going to do. And that allows us to plan, and planning is a good thing. If you can formulate a plan, you can get a lot done that way, as opposed to living in the moment. Some people live in the moment. They get up every day and only decide that day what they're going to do. Other people have a long-term plan. Some people say, look, I want to run a marathon in 4 months. And you can't just wake up one day and run a marathon. It's too hard. You've got to prepare your body for it and your mind. So when I used to run marathons, if I were planning to run the White Rock Marathon in Dallas in the middle of December, I had to start training for it on Labor Day, which is early in September. And it was, as you know, it's very hot in Texas in early September. And it's very difficult to run, especially long distances, in the heat. But if you plan to run the White Rock Marathon in December when it's cold, you've got to start training when it's hot. And each week, you've got to do a progressively longer run. So I would start off in early September with maybe a 9-mile run. And it was brutal, let me tell you. A brutal, brutal thing to run 9 miles in the heat of early September in Texas. The next week, I would pick it up. I might run 10 miles the next weekend, either Saturday or Sunday, 10-mile run. The following week, I might go up to 11 or 12, and so on. Each week, you increase the distance. Now, I'm assuming you're going to do shorter runs during the week, so it's not just one run per week. In fact, I would run 3 or 4 or 5 days a week. I'm talking about that long run. Each week you do a long run, and that long run gets longer and longer. About 2 weeks before your marathon, you do maybe a 20 or 21 mile run. A marathon is 26 miles. So you want to build up your stamina, your endurance, so that you know you can run 20 miles, perhaps without stopping. If you can run 20 miles 2 weeks before the marathon, almost certainly you can run 26 miles on marathon day, and that's your goal. Usually 1 week before the marathon, you taper down. You might run just 12 miles. All right, you want to let your body rest fully for that event, that marathon. Okay, sorry to go into so much detail, but I can't think of a better example where planning is crucially important. If you want to run a marathon, if you want to do well and feel good about yourself, and certainly if you're competitive and you want to win a medal or something, you've got to prepare and plan. So you may get up on a particular day in October and not feel like running, right? But you don't get to decide that. You've already decided back in September what your goal is, and you've got a plan to achieve that goal. So you get up in October and you say, oh, I don't feel like running today. But guess what? You would get out and run anyway. You force yourself to do it. Why? Because it's part of your plan. So I'm talking about the importance of planning your life rather than getting up every day and saying, what am I going to do today? I don't know, let me think. Right? I, for one, have all kinds of plans. I have short-term plans, long-term plans. I may be working on an article or a book, and I chip away at it each day. And eventually it gets done. That's the way I planned it. So, back to the point. The institution of promising is valuable to us because it facilitates planning. which is a good way to order and structure your life. You are more efficient when you plan things. You're more productive when you plan things. And those are all good things for us individually and for society generally. So my point, to go back to my point, even act utilitarians care about keeping promises. And they would say that for the most part, it's right to keep your promises. It's obligatory to keep your promises. But they don't want to say in every case. The act utilitarian wants to leave open the possibility, sorry, I'm wagging my finger at you. The act utilitarian wants to leave open the possibility that on a particular occasion, it's right to break a promise. Even though in the vast majority of cases, it's right to keep the promise. Did I misspeak? I wish I could replay this. Let me say it again in case I misspoke. The act utilitarian would say that in the vast majority of cases, it's right to keep your promise. But there may arise a case occasionally where it's right to break a promise. And that's because the utility of breaking the promise in that case outweighs the utility of any other act that you could do, including keeping the promise. Okay, so let's bring this all together. Because the act utilitarian understands that keeping promises produces good utility, high utility in almost all cases, and therefore that breaking promises almost always has bad effects, the act utilitarian formulates what's called a rule of thumb. A rule of thumb. I'm sure you've heard that phrase. A rule of thumb is a handy rule. It's handy because you can fall back on it in an emergency situation or in any situation where you don't have time to do a full calculation, a Benthamite calculation. So what rule of thumb would an act utilitarian use? It would be keep your promises. Unless you have time to do a calculation at a particular moment, you should just keep your promise. Why? Because the overwhelming likelihood is that keeping the promise will maximize utility, and that is your goal if you're an act utilitarian, right? So rules of thumb are handy devices that will allow you to do what is probably the right act when you don't have time or the luxury of doing a calculation. So what are some other rules of thumb that an act utilitarian would endorse? I think we talked about them a few lectures ago. Keep your promises, tell the truth, refrain from killing other people, refrain from battering people, punching them, for example, or stabbing them, refrain from stealing, and so on. So there are all kinds of useful rules of thumb that even an act utilitarian would endorse. But keep this in mind. To an act utilitarian, these rules are to be dispensed with or gotten rid of whenever you have the luxury of doing a calculation and your calculation shows that not following the rule would maximize utility. Okay, so these rules are just handy, useful devices when you don't have time to do a calculation. So the grandson, who we are assuming to be an act utilitarian, would, if he had no time to do a calculation, what would he choose to do? He would keep his promise, because the rule of thumb is keep your promise, keep your promises. But the grandson does have the luxury of time to do a calculation. Certainly the grandson has enough time to consider 4 alternative acts, the ones we went over: bury the body, cut the body up and use it for bait, let it rot, drag it into the ocean to let it float away. It wouldn't take that long, after all, for the grandson to run through the various possibilities, do a quick calculation, and then act upon it. So here is the objection to act utilitarianism put in a formal way. In fact, it's a modus tollens argument, which by now you know what that means. This is from Feldman, page 53, and this is verbatim. This is exactly what he says on that page. Premise number 1, if U7 is true, the grandson, or then the grandson, is not morally obligated to bury the body. That seems plausible, doesn't it? Based upon the calculation we did, it looks like U sub 7 says to the grandson, you're not morally obligated to bury the body. Second premise, the grandson is morally obligated to bury the body. So that's the voice of conscience speaking. That's the voice of the decent person who's looking on at this situation. Most people probably would say to the grandson, oh no, you've got to bury that body because you promised to do so. Okay, so the second premise is the voice of the critic. The grandson is morally obligated to bury the body. That's the voice of common sense speaking. What's the conclusion of this argument? Remember, this argument is made by a critic of U sub 7. The conclusion is that U sub 7 is not true. So it's a standard modus tollens argument. You've seen this form of argument before. The conclusion is that U sub 7 is not true. The argument form is valid, remember. So an act utilitarian has only two options. If you're going to reject the conclusion, you've got to either grab the bull by the horn and reject the if-then premise, the first premise, or bite the bullet and reject the second premise. So let's explore those one at a time. How do you grab the bull by the horn? Well, you have to show that your theory does not have the stated implication. In this case, you have to show, if you're an act utilitarian, that your theory does not actually imply that the grandson is not morally obligated to bury the body. And you might try to do that by pointing out that we've ignored certain consequences, that we didn't do the calculation properly. For example, maybe we underestimated the bad effect that this act would have on the grandson. He's going to be guilty. And that's a dolor. Those are dolors, his guilt. He may be racked with guilt for the rest of his life. And that's going to add up to a lot of dolors. Also, other people may observe the broken promise and be more inclined to break promises of their own, thereby chipping away at the institution of promising. So one strategy of the act utilitarian is to grab the bull by the horn and claim that the utility calculation has not been done correctly, that certain bad consequences of breaking the promise have not been taken into account. But you know what? That strategy won't work in this case. And now I hope you can see why this case was so weird. Why did Feldman put all these little tidbits into the story? Well, it's because he wanted to strip away what are usually bad consequences from breaking a promise. The bad consequences of promise breaking don't apply in this case. So let's run through them. I'm going to go back to the four things I mentioned earlier. Usually, broken promises have bad effects on the promisee, the person to whom the promise was made. Is that the case in this grandson example? Who's the promisee? It's the grandfather. Is the grandfather going to be frustrated or disappointed or angered by the broken promise? Is the grandfather going to have his reliance on the promise being kept disappointed? No. Why not? Because the grandfather's dead. Feldman killed off the promisee in this example. How convenient, right? Feldman described a case where there is no longer a promisee, and therefore the promisee does not experience any bad effects from the broken promise. All right, that's the first. Second, we said that there are typically, when a promise is broken, it has bad effects on the observers of the broken promise, third parties or bystanders. Are there any in this case? No. Why not? It's on a desert island. Once the grandfather dies, there's only the grandson left. There's no one who knows about the broken promise, and therefore nobody who can act upon the knowledge and break promises of their own. Okay, so now you know why this case was set on a desert island, right? to prevent other people from finding out about the broken promise and then breaking promises of their own. Third, we noticed that the promisor usually has bad effects or experiences bad effects, guilt, remorse, and so on. Well, in this case, that doesn't apply. Why not? Remember from our reading of the facts on page 52, Feldman described the young man as an ingrate and as being callous. This grandson has a particular psychology. He may be pathological. The ordinary person, like you and me, would feel guilt and compunction. We would have qualms about breaking a promise, especially a solemn promise to someone who's been our benefactor. But this grandson is not like that. He's callous. He doesn't care. Right? We're told that he doesn't care one bit about breaking a promise to his grandfather. He's an ingrate. An ingrate is someone who fails to express gratitude when it's appropriate. And this grandson had every reason to express gratitude to his grandfather because he had been given so much that he wasn't owed. So the usual bad effects on the promisor don't obtain or apply in this case because this grandson is a weirdo. He's pathological. And finally, the institution of promising itself won't suffer, mainly because there are no third parties to be influenced by this broken promise. So if the grandson's broken promise chips away at the foundation of promising, it'll be just one little chip representing that broken promise. And that won't cause the whole edifice to come tumbling down. So isn't that interesting? Feldman described a case where the usual bad effects of breaking a promise don't apply, which makes it look like breaking the promise is the right thing to do. This case, because it's so rare and strange and weird and maybe creepy, this case suggests that the right thing to do is actually to break the promise. And notice the second premise. If the act utilitarian bites the bullet and denies the second premise, what is the act utilitarian saying? Well, let's break it down. The second premise says the grandson is morally obligated to bury the body. If you deny that, you're saying the grandson is not morally obligated to bury the body. And given the facts of this case, that's something the utilitarian would be willing to say. The utilitarian would say, ordinarily you ought to keep your promises, but in this strange, weird case, you ought to break your promise because it will have no bad effects. Grandfather's dead, grandson's callous, no third parties to be influenced by the broken promise. It won't affect the institution of promising. So what we have here is a very unusual case where it looks like breaking the promise is the right thing to do. How do you feel about that? Are you persuaded? Do you think that that's the right conclusion? Or I suspect that for some of you, maybe many, perhaps even all of you, you would say, no, I'm not persuaded. I think the grandson ought to keep the promise anyway, even though there are other actions that he could perform that would produce a greater amount of happiness. Right? Promises must be kept. Some people are absolutists about that. Do you realize? There are people known as absolutists who say that promises once made must be kept, no matter what the consequences are. Now that's a pretty hard doctrine to hold, isn't it? Because what about the case I described earlier? I made a promise to my friend to meet him or her for lunch. I'll say it's him. To meet him for lunch. Okay? It's a promise. It's a solemn, binding promise, but it's not a very important promise, right? We can agree on that. On the way to meet my friend, I come across an accident. Maybe I have some medical training. I stop, thinking that maybe I can save a life or prevent some other form of harm. I stop, I render assistance, and that causes me to miss my appointment. And that means causes me to break my promise to my friend. It's the same example I discussed earlier. many people would say that you are doing the right thing when you break that promise. An absolutist would say, no, you must keep your promises, even in this case. So we have really three views on the question of promising. The absolutist says all promises must be kept, period. No attention to consequences at all. Keep your promises, period. No ifs, ands, or buts. And there may very well be people who hold that view. At the other extreme are people, the act utilitarians. Act utilitarians say there's nothing sacred about a promise. A promise is simply an act. And breaking a promise is simply an act. And keeping a promise is an act. Notice we've got three things. Making the promise, that's an act. Keeping the promise, that's a separate act. Breaking the promise, that's a separate act. To an act utilitarian, each of those acts must be evaluated separately on its own merits. Whether you should make a promise at all on a particular occasion depends on the utility of doing so. It may be right to make the promise. It may be wrong, depending on how the utility calculation comes out. If you've made a promise and the time comes to keep it, you now have to make a fresh decision that's independent of the fact that you made a promise. The independent decision is, do I keep the promise? Yes or no? If the answer is yes, then you'll keep the promise. Because, is the answer yes because you've made a promise in the past? No. The only reason to keep a promise, according to an act utilitarian, is that doing so would maximize overall utility or happiness. If you decide to break a promise, that's because you have come to the conclusion that breaking it would maximize overall happiness. So, once again, the absolutist is over here. The absolutist says, keep your promises, come what may, no matter what. The act utilitarian is at the other extreme. The act utilitarian says, whether you should keep or break a promise depends on nothing other than the consequences of keeping or breaking the promise. The fact that you have made a promise in the past is irrelevant. Now, I said there are three possibilities. We got the extreme view over here, absolutism. We've got the other extreme over here, which is act utilitarianism. What's that middle position? The middle position is someone who says that breaking a promise is wrong in and of itself, but it can be right in particular cases where the consequences of keeping the promise would be catastrophic. In other words, the middle position is you ought to keep your promises unless doing so would create a catastrophe, right? Where lots of lost lives or harmed people. Notice, that's a middle position. It's not the absolutist, and it's certainly not the act utilitarian. What this middle position says, and I'm not going to give it a name, I'll just call it the middle position. It says that promise keeping is important. It has intrinsic moral significance. But I'm not an absolutist about it. I'm willing to allow a promise to be broken, provided it falls within an exception clause. And the exception is to avert catastrophe. And that's a pretty high bar, right? It's pretty rare when we need to break a promise in order to avert a catastrophe where lots of lives are lost or something like that. So that really is a middle position. It gives more weight to the fact that a promise was made than the act utilitarian. Let's see now. This is the absolutist over here. This is the act utilitarian. So that middle position gives more weight to the fact that a promise was made than the act utilitarian, but less weight than the absolutist. Are you with me? So we really have three positions on promises. And I suspect that most people adopt that middle position. Maybe you're one of them. Most people are not willing to go the absolutist route. because it's a hard doctrine. It tells you that you have to keep your promise even if breaking it would avert catastrophe. In other words, you have to keep your promises even when doing so would enable a catastrophe. And that's a hard doctrine to accept. And I don't think most people agree with the act utilitarian either. The act utilitarian really doesn't respect promises. To an act utilitarian, listen carefully now, to an act utilitarian, the fact that you have made a promise has no moral significance at all. Why? Because that's in the past. When the time comes to keep a promise that you have made, you should forget about the fact that you've made a promise. That's irrelevant. The only thing that's relevant is what will happen as a result of keeping versus breaking the promise. So act utilitarianism looks only into the future. It never looks back. And what I'm saying is I think most people do look back. Most people think it's morally relevant that you made a promise. Okay? So let's look at the act utilitarian can try either grabbing the bull by the horn or biting the bullet. And maybe biting the bullet is the more persuasive, the more plausible strategy in this case, in the grandson case, because of the strange nature of the case, right? The weird nature of it. So look at page 55. We're almost done for the day. This is a new objection made by Feldman. Think of this as a generic objection to act utilitarianism. The earlier objection that we went over, the modus tollens argument, think of as the particular objection because it was about the grandson case. This new objection isn't about any case in particular. So it's generic. And here's how it goes. It's also modus tollens, by the way. First premise, if U sub 7 is true, then the only moral reason for keeping a promise is that doing so would maximize utility. If U sub 7 is true, then there's only one reason ever to keep a promise, and that reason is it will maximize overall utility. The critic then points out, premise number 2, that that's false. There are other reasons to keep promises than the fact that they will produce the greatest overall utility, namely the fact that you made it, right? The critic says, wait a minute, there are other relevant factors here besides how much happiness your keeping the promise will produce. You should also be concerned with the fact that you made a promise, which was in the past. Therefore, U sub 7 is not true. So this is a general objection to act utilitarianism. What it says, in effect, is you act utilitarians just don't understand the value or the value of a promise or what makes a promise significant. Right? The institution of promising is a valuable institution, and we ought to keep our promises because we have made them. After all, nobody makes you make a promise. Theoretically, you could live your whole life without ever making a promise. And if you never make a promise, then you never have to decide whether to keep or break a promise. Why? Because you haven't made any. So you can always avoid the obligation to keep a promise by not making a promise. So my point is that the utilitarian plays fast and loose with the institution of promising. The utilitarian attaches no significance morally to the fact that you made a promise. And I think that grates on most people. Most people want to disagree with that and say, no, you made a promise. That was a solemn undertaking. Nobody made you do it. You voluntarily made a promise. Other people relied on it. You've got to keep that promise. Unless it's necessary to avert catastrophe, then you may break it. So what is Feldman's conclusion in this section? On page 55, he says, it appears that some facts about promising provide us with a major objection to act utilitarianism as ordinarily understood. He then points out that the morality of promises objection, actually he doesn't say this, he might have said that this objection decisively refutes act utilitarianism, because later you'll see that he says that about ethical egoism. We haven't gotten to that theory yet, but when we do, you'll see that Feldman is much bolder. Feldman is willing to say that a particular case decisively refutes the theory. And I wonder why he doesn't say that here. Why does this grandson case not decisively refute act utilitarianism? But he never says that. All he says is that it appears that some facts about promising provide us with a major objection to act utilitarianism as ordinarily understood. So I think Feldman's verdict on this promising section is that an act utilitarian has to either bite the bullet and say that certain promises may be broken, or try to explain why, in a case like the grandson, the utilities haven't been correctly carried out, and it's not, after all, right for the grandson to break the promise. Okay, so that's the section on promising. We're going to take up a new challenge to act utilitarianism next week on the first lecture. It's in the section called punishment. So please, before you watch the first video next week, please read carefully Feldman's section entitled Punishment. It's in chapter 4. So have a great day. I'm a little bit over an hour, which is about what I expected. So have a great day. Have a nice weekend. I will post on Canvas a summary of statistics on the first exam. And I assume you know your score now, having taken the exam. So the statistics are designed to give you an idea of how you did relative to the other students who took the exam. So have a great day and a great weekend. I'll see you on the screen next week.